Blade Runner is a philosophical masterpiece, and there's one line in this film that, once you hear it, you can never unhear.
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave.
For me, that's the real question this movie is asking, not just about its characters, but about all of us. Are we slaves? For 40 years now, critics and fans alike have been obsessing over whether Deckard is a replicant or whether Batty represents Christ, whether Rachel's memories really matter, but they're missing the point entirely. Blade Runner isn't asking what makes us human. It actually answers that question in the first 5 seconds of the film. What it's really asking is, what does it mean to be enslaved? And in this neon-soaked hellscape, who amongst us is actually free? This question haunts every single frame of the film, and we keep encountering the same figure, a decent person, trapped in a corrupt machine, forced to do terrible things for people they'll never even meet. And as I'll show you in this video, the answers to these questions are woven throughout Blade Runner. You just have to know where to look. Now, you voted this as your most wanted film for the channel, and you were absolutely right to choose it. I've gone through everything, every release, Paul Salmon's exhaustive behind-the-scenes book, interviews, alternate scripts, deleted footage, and what I found is both shocking and unnervingly relevant to where we are right now. So let's dive in. This is Philosophical Film Club, where we uncover the big ideas hiding in beloved films, and Blade Runner is absolutely loaded with them. So what actually happens in this film? And fair warning, spoilers ahead. And if you're watching along, I'm using the 2007 final cut, which, after a maze of studio battles and director's cuts I won't drag you through, is essentially Ridley Scott's definitive vision of the film. So, we're in Los Angeles, 2019, an overpopulated hellscape where ordinary people scrape by in the shadows of corporate pyramids that house a handful of oligarchs. The traffic is about the same. Replicants, we learn, are genetically identical to humans, but legally classified as property. The opening text doesn't mince words. They're slave labor, engineered with 4-year lifespans to work the system's worst jobs. If they're caught on Earth, Blade Runners hunt them down and retire them. That's the euphemism that transforms murder into paperwork. We meet Rick Deckard at a rain-soaked noodle stand. He's a washed-up Blade Runner being dragged back into service. His old police boss, Bryant, makes the terms crystal clear.
You know the score, pal. You're not cops, you're little people.
No choice, huh?
No choice, pal.
That's soft coercion in action, and it works because in this dystopia, everyone below those corporate pyramids is disposable. As we'll see, the replicants aren't the only slaves here. Deckard's assignment? Hunt 4 escaped replicants led by Roy Batty, each with only months left to live and getting more desperate by the day. When Deckard visits the Tyrell Corporation's massive pyramid to study the new models, he meets Eldon Tyrell, basically the Wizard of Oz of this story, and Rachel, his assistant. One Voight-Kampff test later, her entire world collapses when she discovers that she's a replicant with implanted memories. Her response to this is prophetic.
I'm not in the business. I am the business.
And all this decades before the dawn of social media. Meanwhile, the replicants are desperately searching for more life. Roy and Pris manipulate JF Sebastian, a lonely genetic designer, to get themselves closer to Tyrell himself. But Deckard's closing in fast. He shoots Zora first, an exotic dancer who's gunned down in the street, shot in the back, dying in a shower of broken glass. When Leon, the other replicant, confronts him afterwards, he delivers this haunting question.
Painful living fear, isn't it?
Rachel saves Deckard by killing Leon, which proves something crucial. Replicants absolutely can feel genuine empathy. Their complicated love affair begins here, though it won't be without consequences. In parallel, Roy finally meets his maker and pleads,
I want more life, Father.
But these men who would be gods, they're powerless. Tyrell can't extend Roy's life, can't undo that 4-year death sentence. Roy's response is biblical in its finality, a tender kiss followed by a violent death. During the final hunt, Deckard shoots Pris mid-scream. Our hero has now killed 2 women, 1 shot in the back. Roy, having lost everything, pursues Deckard through Sebastian's decaying apartment building. And as they fight, he challenges Deckard's entire moral framework.
Not very sporting to fire on an unarmed opponent.
On the rooftops, both men have run out of time. Roy's dying, but he's already won. When Deckard leaps across the rooftops and misses, dangling from a girder, Roy could simply let him fall. Instead, he pulls him up, easily, almost joyfully. Then comes that famous tears in the rain speech, before he dies exactly on schedule, but crucially, not as anybody's property. Deckard receives the faintest possible praise.
Done a man's job, sir. I guess you're through, huh?
Finished.
He finds Rachel, discovers Gaff's origami unicorn, that little paper accusation, and as those elevator doors close, our time with Blade Runner ends. So what does all of this actually mean? Well, here's what everybody keeps missing about the film. From the very first frame to the very last, Blade Runner makes something crystal clear. This human versus replicant question, it's not actually a question at all. The replicants are us. They have desires, dreams, they rage against the machine, and those impossible hopes for a different future that we all recognise. To paraphrase Shakespeare, and it's surprisingly relevant here, if you prick them, do they not bleed? Well, Deckard shoots them, but you get the point. Now, if you're waiting for some theological explanation of this film, Ridley Scott slams the door shut pretty definitively. Tyrell sets himself up as a god. But when Roy Batty finally meets his maker and discovers there's no miracle patch, no software update, no mercy whatsoever, Roy puts a little Nietzsche into practice. When Nietzsche wrote "God is dead and we killed him" in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he probably didn't imagine that a replicant would be literally acting it out in 2019. But that's exactly what happens in the film when Roy destroys his now powerless creator. And I think in that moment, he shatters any religious reading of this film, which means that the political critique suddenly comes into razor-sharp focus. Which brings us to our hired gun with the empathy test. Deckard assumes what everybody's told him, that Nexus 6 models don't have empathy, but he's wrong. He's dead wrong. These replicants absolutely have empathy, and the more they experience the world and each other, the more it grows. And this is actually a massive departure from Philip K. Dick's source material. In Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the book the film is based on, the androids genuinely are empathyless. They kill without remorse. They tear the legs off spiders for fun. They reject what's called mercerism, which is the novel's empathetic religion. This fundamental difference even sparked an hour-long argument between Philip K. Dick and Ridley Scott during post-production in 1982. According to Paul Salmon's exhaustive history of the film, nobody knows exactly what was said, but Scott's vision won out. His replicants have empathy that deepens with experience. The implication being, give them more than 4 years and who knows how much they could develop. Which brings us back to the film's central irony. It's Deckard who needs the empathy test. Not because he might secretly be a replicant, but exactly the opposite. Because he's a human whose empathy has been systematically extracted by a machine that turns decent people into instruments of violence. He's been drafted, he's been threatened, and he's been euphemized into complicity. Hunting escaped slaves because, as Bryant tells him,
No choice, pal.
like Dick's anti-hero, the job has hollowed him out. But unlike the novel, the film shows us precisely how the system accomplishes this destruction. So the question was never, are replicants human? Every single thing they do, the fear, the care, the solidarity, the mercy, proves that they are. The real question is whether Deckard can remain human, while serving as the system's faceless enforcer, denying dignity to beings whose humanity is blazing from every frame. It takes Roy's gift on that rooftop, an act of grace from someone with everything to lose, to crack open Deckard's possibility for refusal, for escape. Let's call it what it is: solidarity from a slave to his hunter. Which leads us to the question that should haunt us. Are we them? And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean quite literally. Do we live under these same conditions, coerced into doing harm, then soothed by corporate language that papers over the damage? What Blade Runner reveals is two forms of slavery operating in parallel, each one reinforcing the other. Roy Batty embodies the first, hard ownership, where your body is owned, your time is stolen, and your personhood is denied. But Rick Deckard represents the second, soft compulsion, where you're pressed into service through threats and bureaucratic language until your own judgment dissolves into that of the system. Both men kill on command. Both want out. And the film watches to see who will break free first. It's a Greek tragedy with just the faintest possibility of escape. And that's why that "to be a slave" line haunts us so much. Because on the rooftop, Roy offers the one thing the city can't commodify: empathy, freely given under a death sentence. In that moment, a door opens. Deckard lowers his gun and takes the smallest possible step towards freedom. It's not redemption, not yet, but it is a beginning. And maybe, walking away from this film, dazed by all that neon and darkness, we might find our own opportunity to seize the same kind of freedom. So let's dive into the hardcore philosophy that'll help us map our potential escape route. We're going to explore domination and refusal through slavery and Agamben's concept of bare life, through Hegel's struggle for recognition, through Marx on alienation and time theft, and on Levinas and the face that commands "do not kill." We're asking a lot of essential questions here, like what does it actually mean to be enslaved? How does empathy get systematically destroyed and then recovered? And can anyone truly be free inside a machine that diagnoses mercy as a malfunction? All of this from a film that laid down its prophecy in 1982, largely ignored at the box office, but now it is impossible to unsee. Before we dive into the theory, we need to examine the system running Blade Runner's world, and particularly one word from that opening crawl: slave. Because the film shows us two interconnected forms of slavery, and they reinforce each other in ways that should feel uncomfortably familiar. First, there's the obvious one: literal ownership, chattel slavery. Replicants aren't born or even created in any meaningful sense. They're manufactured. They're property, designed as rewards for off-world colonists, though corporations use them for everything. Each model gets a function stamped on them. Pris is a basic pleasure model, Leon does hazardous environmental labour, Zora was built for assassination, and Roy Batty for elite combat. They're not people, they're equipment with expiration dates. Now, this isn't exactly a parallel to transatlantic slavery, but it does mirror ancient Roman and Greek systems, where slaves filled specialised roles, everything from manual labour to highly educated positions, while remaining property under the paterfamilias. And here's why that parallel matters, because ancient slaves were often defeated peoples who were just as accomplished, sometimes more accomplished, than their masters. That's exactly the threat that the replicants in Blade Runner represent. In both ancient Rome and in this film, the enslaved form a parallel society, just as capable as their masters, far more desperate, and constantly on the edge of revolt. That's explicitly why the replicants got banned from Earth after that bloody mutiny mentioned in the opening. And it's no accident that Ridley Scott would later explore this exact dynamic in Gladiator, where a master tumbles into slavery's shadow world and ignites the inevitable uprising.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained?
The myth that replicants lack something, like empathy or humanity or dignity, that's essential psychological armour for a population that's being outclassed by what it owns. Dick's novel makes this even more explicit with what he calls chicken heads, which are humans damaged by radiation who are still considered superior to perfect androids. But the film cuts deeper than the book. It's like a science fiction X-ray of domination, revealing how a society can own bodies outright while simultaneously compelling everybody else through softer chains. No legal title to your skin required. The first form of control is easy to spot because the law announces it openly. Replicants are property, illegal on Earth, subject to summary retirement on site. And that euphemism is doing some heavy lifting. It converts killing into paperwork. And once murder gets a form number, moral attention just evaporates. The point isn't whether replicants pass some humanity test. It's that the system has manufactured a class of killable people, beings whose death are pre-justified by their nomenclature alone. And this comes straight from Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer. He describes figures that are under the band, stripped to what he calls bare life, who can be killed without it counting as homicide, yet can't even be dignified as sacrifice. This happens through what he calls a state of exception, where laws get suspended in order to apply more absolutely. You're included in the legal system only as someone it owes zero protection. In Blade Runner, the mechanism is completely transparent. Declare replicants illegal, rename killing as retirement, and you've created beings living where law and violence become indistinguishable. So is it a surprise that they become violent themselves? But here is Agamben's crucial insight. The exception doesn't stay on the margins. It becomes the paradigm at the core that shapes everything. Once a society normalizes killing certain beings on sight, everyone gets governed in reference to that line. The camp isn't some aberration. It's modernity's hidden logic, according to Agamben, with procedures and checkpoints spreading outwards until everyday life gets managed, as if we're all one step from that threshold. In Scott's Los Angeles, the systems designed for replicants, the test for personhood, the memory implants, the euphemistic killing, they inevitably bleed into how everybody gets governed. The hard exception down at the docks justifies the soft compulsion in Bryant's office. The existence of a killable category creates the atmosphere where little people learn to comply. See, the law doesn't describe reality, it manufactures it. Name something equipment and suddenly it can be possessed like any other broken machine. Blade Runner shows us Deckard operating as judge, as jury, and as executioner, all rolled into one. Imagine an entire legal system built on this principle. Sounds dreadful. The institutions built around this system work exactly as you'd expect. Tyrell Corporation designs the bodies, the police enforce the categories, and language keeps the whole machine humming. Terms like basic pleasure model and combat model, they don't describe souls, they assign functions. And once that function gets assigned, everything else follows. Movements restricted, time rationed, death scheduled. Zora doesn't die from some tragic misunderstanding. She dies because the system has already determined what verb applies to her body. The second form of control is quieter, which makes it more familiar to most of us. Scott's film, like Agamben's theory, shows us how easily the line between the disposable and everybody else dissolves. Even when that line holds, we all still live in relation to it. Call this one soft slavery. Not chains, but leverage, and not the auction block, but the HR file. And Deckard, in this respect, in the film, becomes our test case for exploring this, because he doesn't want the job, but Brian tells him with that dead-eyed smile, no choice, pal. And the follow-up, that comment about the little people, that's not tough guy posturing. That's the grammar and the logic of bureaucratic coercion laid bare. Your status, your income, your sense of belonging, they all depend on compliance. Step out of line and you face social and economic consequences and potentially erasure. So you learn to rent out your conscience by the hour and call it professionalism. Deckard has absolutely mastered this transaction. But soft control also offers carrots alongside sticks. Those building high ads and the relentless blimp that keeps selling an impossible dream through the acid rain is an essential part of this. It says, a new life in the off-world colonies, a golden land of opportunity and adventure. It's almost comedic when you realise that these trapped masses, they're not going anywhere. The ads aren't selling a destination, they're selling an aesthetic. And here's the insidious genius of the system. You won't revolt against what you think you can escape. And that dream works just like a pressure valve, releasing just enough steam to prevent the explosion while the extraction machine keeps grinding away underneath. And despite all of the film's technological saturations, it's actually humanity's oldest technology that makes both forms of domination actually work. Language. Retire instead of kill. Skin job instead of person, model instead of woman. These euphemisms aren't just polite, they're the solvents that dissolve the reality Deckard and everybody else would otherwise have to confront. The film proves this point through contrast. When it strips away the euphemism, when we see Zora's body on the broken glass or Rachel's hand trembling at the piano, that's when the grammar of domination falters. We feel the weight of what the words were hiding. These become the film's most devastating moments precisely because language can no longer protect us or hide what is actually happening. So why do I insist on examining both forms of domination together? Well, it's because I think that this film functions as a mirror, reflecting us now, and audiences in 1982, and whoever watches this film in future. And it's a mirror that only works if we recognise that hard ownership and soft compulsion are just dialects of the same language. Roy Batty exemplifies the first: body-owned, time-capped, personhood illegal. Rick Deckard embodies the second: judgment leased to a chain of command, livelihood held hostage by a file, and violence laundered through euphemisms that fit neatly into reports. Both men become instruments. Both inflict harm. Both get told that this is simply how the world works. And who are they to argue with reality? Both of them struggle to be good men inside machinery designed to make goodness impossible. So here's our working definition. To be enslaved means having your body, your time, and your choices captured by a system that calls its demands reality. Sometimes that capture is spectacular. You're declared property, for example, and hunted. Sometimes it's banal. It's your mortgage or your badge or your boss's smile. Sometimes they just accomplish that same work quietly. Either way, you are scripted into tasks and given just enough language to sleep at night, all while being convinced that you have no choice. And this is where philosophy begins, not ends. Hegel's going to ask whether recognition, truly seeing and being seen, can pierce through the machinery designed to prevent it. Marx will argue that without controlling the clock that measures your life, risk means nothing. And Levinas is waiting for us on those rooftops, where the oldest ethical demand, the face saying, "Do not kill me," has to survive our habit of calling murder retirement. And now we turn to, oh no, Hegel? Well, you did it. You finally made me reread GWF Hegel. Thanks for that. But seriously, Hegel is exactly the right lens here. Not because Blade Runner is secretly a German idealist track, but because his basic claim about freedom cuts straight to the film's core. Hegel claims that freedom isn't something you're born with, it's a relationship you achieve. This becomes essential for later philosophers who use it while wrestling with Hegel's dense, borderline unreadable prose to argue that freedom is something we produce, not something that we find. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, specifically the Lordship and Bondage section, and in his notes towards a system of ethical life, Hegel argues that selfhood isn't some passport that you carry around. It's a relation that you achieve through others. A self only truly becomes itself when another self acknowledges it as such. Desire, for Hegel, ultimately comes down to the desire for recognition, at least in Alexander Koyev's influential reading. It's complicated. Now, this acknowledgement isn't handed out like a participation trophy. You win it through struggle, where both sides risk something real, including sometimes their lives. Hegel dramatizes this as, quote, a fight to the death, because only mortal risks proves that you're more than just appetites and survival instinct. But here's the immediate paradox. If one party chooses safety and makes the other subordinate, you get hierarchy, but not recognition. This master enjoys the slave's labour, but only gets one-sided acknowledgement. He's master in the eyes of someone he refuses to see as a subject. And we mean subject in the philosophical self sense here. The victory is complete, but hollow. And here's where Hegel's reversal really bites. The master, insulated from necessity, never actually works on the world. He just consumes what others make, and he becomes dependent on the slave to mediate reality for him. Meanwhile, the slave, having faced death and returned to work, gets transformed by two forces, fear and labour. Fear shatters the slave's complacency when suddenly they realise that they're not just their social role or their pleasures. Then labour takes that disruption and channels it outward. By shaping resistant material, the worker sees in himself what he creates and develops with this patient freedom that the master, who only commands and consumes, can never really achieve. What looks like domination? Hegel argues that it's actually a form of spiritual starvation. So recognition in Hegel requires both risk and self-formation. You have to expose yourself to another's will and submit to the discipline of making things. Risk without work stays shallow. Work without risk stays unfree. Only when both come together does freedom actually mean something. Hegel also gives us a political warning. One moment of recognition on a rooftop doesn't create an ethical society. Recognition needs to be stabilized, woven into institutions where people reliably matter to each other, what he calls Sittlichkeit, or the ethical life. When society builds institutions that deny recognition through things like files and euphemisms and killable categories, you don't get neutral administration. You get misrecognition, scaled up and made routine. The master lives by procedures that hollow him out, while the slave sustains an entire world unseen. And does that sound familiar? Because when you apply this framework to Blade Runner, the film's crucial moments suddenly snap into focus. Tyrell is Hegel's master, who never risks anything and never works. His power is tissue thin. Deckard performs mastery through his badge and his gun, but he lets procedure do all of his seeing for him, which means his sense of self is starving. But Roy has faced both fear and labour in their rawest forms, surviving minute by minute against that death clock. When he forces that moment of recognition by risking his remaining life, he's not destroying the system, but he is interrupting domination, exposing the master's dependency and letting genuine freedom break through, even if just for a moment. Now, down in Sebastian's apartment, we watch this dialectic play out again, but now Roy's in control. He doesn't just attack Deckard, he puts him on trial. That's not just mockery. It's challenging Deckard to drop the procedure manual and actually see Roy as a person. But Deckard can't or won't, because his soft slavery's grammar keeps him trapped. He thinks he has to finish the job he never wanted, so he clings to his role just like he'll cling to that girder, which proves Hegel's exact point. Authority without risk is counterfeit recognition. Sure, you're called good, but that title carries no weight because you haven't earned it. Deckard's just inherited it through the perspective of the film, with him as its ostensible hero, and through bureaucratic momentum. Everything becomes real on that rooftop. Both men's scripts have run out and Deckard is dangling from a beam, and Roy has the complete power to let him fall. But instead of revenge, Roy does the unthinkable. He burns his last precious minutes saving his hunter. In that single gesture, he creates the recognition that's been impossible until now. We're watching Roy refuse to let domination define him. He chooses connection. The hand that punched through the walls becomes the hand that saves. And in those final seconds before his clock expires, Roy achieves exactly what Hegel described: freedom that only comes when you break from your assigned script and choose something else entirely. Two massive implications flow from this moment. First, the master's dependency gets exposed. Tyrell's sovereignty crumbles the moment it meets someone who will risk everything to defy it. And Brian's authority means nothing to someone who simply walks away. Even Gaff seems to respect this. And secondly, Roy's gift spreads. Recognition is contagious, and Roy hands Deckard a way to see what the job has extracted from him: his empathy and his humanity. You can literally watch Harrison Ford's face rediscover this in real time. And that's the ethical hinge of this entire film. It's a single act in the rain that restores one relationship this system organised itself to prevent: solidarity between the enslaved. Hegel gets us this far. But if recognition is the film's philosophical grammar, its effects are economic. The forces that built this overcrowded metropolis, that keep people pinned there, that keep the machine running, for those, we need Marx. Specifically, we need to talk about alienation, time theft, and the devastating truth that this movie won't let us ignore. If you don't own the clock, you don't own your life. Now, I'm bringing in Marx here somewhat reluctantly, but Hegel and recognition alone don't explain why Blade Runner's 2019 Los Angeles is such a corporate hellscape. For that, we need political economy, an analysis of who controls the bodies, the tools, the schedules, and the story we tell about all three of them. Marx's word for the damage this kind of control creates is alienation. And look, I think we all understand this idea intuitively, but Marx helps us put conceptual flesh on those bones. Every time I watch Deckard in this movie, haggling for noodles in the rain, that's the word that hits me: alienation. In his early writings, Marx breaks alienation into four connected forms: alienation from what you produce, from the process of working, from other people, and from what he calls species being, basically your human capacity to set your own goals and shape a life through conscious choices. Think of these as diagnostic tools. When they show up, you're being used. And Deckard, his readings are off the charts on all four. So what does this look like in Blade Runner? Well, let's start with the products themselves, the replicants. Their alienation in its purest form. They don't own themselves, and they certainly don't own what they produce. They're manufactured to specifications, sold into tasks, and when those tasks end or become inconvenient, they're eliminated. Zora doesn't die from some misunderstanding. She dies because the system has already determined what counts as successful retirement and what goes into the report. The product gets reclaimed by the ledger that created it. And that's alienation at its most basic, when what you are and what you make belong to somebody else. But Marx says it's just not about the products. It's also about the process. Work becomes alienating when its goals, its rhythms, and the methods get imposed from the outside. And we all know this feeling, right? I mean, who doesn't want to set their own schedule, decide how and when to do things? Well, the Nexus 6 replicants don't just get assigned their functions. Their learning curves and their lifespans are all engineered. That 4-year cap isn't just a plot device, it's explicit control. Tyrell tries to justify it with his dubious, self-serving line.
The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long. And you have burned so very, very brightly, Roy.
In those 4 years, the replicants can't build real experience. They can't develop habits. They can't form loyalties. They can't create long-term projects. Their usable time is compressed by design. They're engineered to barely acquire the very things that make us human. Marx argued that capitalism does this as well, through schedules, through quotas, and through surveillance. But Blade Runner makes it literal, with incept dates and kill switches. When Roy says, "I want more life," he's not being poetic. He's demanding the basic precondition for freedom: time you can actually use. And alienation from others follows automatically once law and the workplace teach you who counts and who doesn't. Declare replicants illegal, rename killing as retirement, and you've created a population towards whom empathy is structurally blocked. Deckard can't see Zora as Zora inside that system. She's a task to complete. She's paperwork to file. Leon can't see Deckard as a person either, just as the hand holding the test and the gun. This is what Marx means when he says that social relations become thing-like. The connection between two people gets replaced by the relationship between a file and a target, or a model and a mission. Now, species being is one of Marx's most complicated concepts, but it's also the most important. He's talking about our distinctly human ability to freely choose what our goals are and recognise in ourselves what we create, basically to just have a life that isn't reactive. The film shows this capacity being crushed from both directions. Rachel's memories were engineered for a specific role, not formed through experience. She has feelings, she has preferences, she's notably bad at the piano, but the story anchoring those traits was written by somebody else. As Deckard cruelly reminds her, they're not hers. She has no say in their creation or in their continuation. Maybe. Compare that to Roy's litany of moments at the end of the film, or Leon's precious photos. These moments move us precisely because they show us a different path, experiences that the replicants chose to value and treasure, and they're things that no file will ever report or recognise. They are tears in rain. The system tries to eliminate Roy before he can make any of those moments matter to anybody else. And Marx helps us see that time is the central mechanism here. Control the clock, control the person. The 4-year limit is the hard version. Bryant's smile when he assigns Deckard's hours, That's the soft version. A petty sovereign distributing time and moral risk to someone who can't safely refuse. Either way, what looks like personal choice is already shaped by somebody else's schedule. When I say own the clock, own the life, I mean it almost literally. Anyone who can't reliably plan, remember, and revise can't be free in any meaningful sense. And this isn't just about replicants. Deckard's not exempt because he's legally human. He's a textbook case of a soft version of alienation. The product of his labour is a body count he can't process as grief because the system's taught him to call killing work and push responsibility upward. He is cut off from others by his role, from species being by his routine. He executes tasks set by others and borrows their language to make it feel almost normal. And when he says he's finished, after Gaff's backhanded compliment, it lands like somebody realising just a beat too late what kind of work has been finishing him. With Marx and Hegel together, we finally reach the core of what Blade Runner is really about. Alienation isn't some passing mood or an unfortunate side effect. It's built into the system. As Silicon Valley would say, it's a feature, not a bug. When products, processes, relationships, and life projects are all externally controlled, you get those two forms of slavery that I keep highlighting. Hard ownership for replicants, soft compulsion for Deckard. And why does recognition keep failing? Well, often it's because there's just not enough time or autonomy in these lives to make that recognition stick. Deckard and everyone else in this film doesn't have time to empathise with the replicants. They don't have the energy left for empathy at all, except in the most extreme of circumstances. And those extreme circumstances, that climactic rooftop encounter, brings us to our last philosopher. I keep returning to Emmanuel Levinas in these videos because I think he captures a fundamental truth that we all experience. And that is that it's really hard to hate someone when you interact with them daily, when you're forced to see their humanity with all their frailties, their vulnerabilities, their basic existence in the world. And for me, Levinas is where this film's moral core lives. He helps us understand why those final 10 minutes feel completely different from everything that came before. His basic move is deceptively simple. Levinas argues that ethics comes before everything, before cognition and before categories, before we overthink things or rationalise them or invent rules or try to pigeonhole someone. First comes the encounter. It's the same raw experience we've had since meeting others on the playground as children, which incidentally is exactly what these replicants are kind of experiencing in their compressed lifespans. In Totality and Infinity, Levinas calls this ethics as first philosophy. What he means is that before I sort you, before I diagnose you, or before I file you away, your presence makes a demand on me. He compresses this into a sentence that's almost embarrassingly blunt for a philosopher, and it's this: the face says, "Do not kill me." Now, face here isn't just fine features and bone structures like mine. It's the vulnerability of another being turned toward you. It's exposure. It's the capacity to be harmed. It's the naked fact that someone arrives without your permission and just by existing limits what you're allowed to do. This isn't empathy as a feeling. It's a moral obligation. Levinas isn't asking me to mirror your emotion or to pass some quiz about your inner life, some kind of Voight-Kampff test. He's saying the ethical relation begins asymmetrically. I'm more responsible for you than you are for me. And that asymmetry is exactly what our bureaucracies and tests try to flatten out. We want measurable reciprocity. We want thresholds we can calibrate. But Levinas says that's getting it all backwards. Obligation comes first, and only then do we build concepts or rules or institutions that try and will inevitably fail to capture this first encounter. Apply this directly to Blade Runner and everything shifts. The system builds a machine to measure empathy and hands it to a man who's losing his own. The Voight-Kampff test pretends ethics is something you can score, but Levinas would say that the test only begins after the ethical event has already happened. Zora's body on the wet pavement, Pris screaming, Rachel's hand trembling at the piano, those are faces in Levinas's sense. They're interruptions that place limits on Deckard's project and the system's entire grammar. When he pulls the trigger anyway, it's not just that he lacks empathy as some character trait. He's refusing a demand that's already been made, treating another's vulnerability as data rather than as a command. The film shows us exactly how this refusal gets taught to someone, how the system dehumanizes replicants and thereby dehumanizes Deckard too. He's trained to see assignments, not individuals. He administers an empathy test, but he can't receive the ethical claim that it's supposedly measuring. We notice it when Leon says, "Painful to live in fear, isn't it?" That's not a gotcha. It's a truth, spoken by someone the file marks as killable. Someone Deckard knows has lived that exact pain and experience. When Roy echoes it on the rooftop, that's what it is to be a slave. He universalizes it for all of us. In Blade Runner, fear isn't a defect of the system. It's the atmosphere everybody's forced to live in. Levinas would say that this analysis of the encounter on the roof works not because it's clever, but because it makes Deckard a witness. And witnessing isn't collecting data. It's being summoned out of your role into your individual, undeniable responsibility. And here's another key distinction from Levinas. It's what he calls the saying versus the said. The said is everything that ends up in those files, the categories, the narratives, everything that can be stored and replayed. But the saying is one person's live, in-person address to another that breaks through those systems and that demands a response right now. Blade Runner overflows with the said. There are dossiers and classifications and euphemism. There's a whole supercomputer that contains them. But Roy's final speech, that's pure saying for Deckard and for the audience. It's not something that's meant to win a technical philosophical argument. It's one life exposing itself to another at the moment when all of those calculations end. Deckard doesn't learn any new information. He receives a summons that reshapes how he'll use whatever time he has left. And this recasts that common claim about replicants learning empathy. Through Levinas, we see that they're not acquiring a new trait, they're entering new relations. Through encounter, through risk, and through loss, they become answerable to each other. When Pris dies, she's not a KPI or a statistic. She's Roy's other, and he carries her death with him. And Rachel, she isn't a case study. She becomes the person Deckard is bound to. And that's why the rooftop is the film's ethical hinge. A man built to fight meets a man trained to follow procedure, and the one with moments to live chooses to honour what that encounter demands of him. It's genuinely beautiful. He gives his time and gains recognition from someone who's spent a career denying it. In plain terms, Levinas helps us see that slavery means living where faces get turned into statistics, reports, anything but the individual encounters themselves. And he shows why the smallest refusals matter. When you answer the face, when you hold back the killing hand, when you spend your minutes on someone else, you're already outside of the grammar of ownership and compulsion. That's not some sentimental addition to the noir aesthetic. It is the point. Roy's gift isn't metaphorical. It's the ethical fact that transforms the rest of Deckard's life. Put Batty and Deckard side by side, and that chase through the Battery suddenly becomes a mirror. Batty embodies the hard-earned freedom, as I've said, with a body-owned, a clock-engineered legal status that authorises his death. And Deckard carries that soft version, conscience rented by the shift, livelihood hostage to assignments, vocabulary that keeps his stomach calm through lies. Both are instruments, both inflict harm, and both are told, both directly and indirectly, that this harm is perfectly ordinary. The difference isn't what they do, it's who breaks free first. Batty answers his trapped existence with risk and with recognition. He refuses to be just a combat model, and he spends his last precious minutes on another person's life. Deckard responds with obedience until Roy's refusal cracks open an escape hatch. Only then does Deckard lower his gun, walk away, and claim a life that he wasn't supposed to have. In Hegel's terms, Batty wins recognition through risk. In Levinas's terms, Deckard finally answers the demand the face has been making of him all along. And here's the lesson for us, because we see how the system rewards them. Batty gets acknowledgement from Deckard and nothing else. Presumably he's scrapped, like all the other replicants. In an earlier draft, Ridley Scott wanted to open with Batty off-world, crawling out from under a mountain of dead replicants. It would have been something wonderful to see, but unfortunately it got cut due to budget. Meanwhile, what does Deckard get? Well, he gets Gaff's backhanded compliment. So as I hope I've illustrated using the film, if slavery means having your body, your time and your choices captured, then Batty and Deckard start in the same grammar. They're just in slightly different dialects. Batty's chains are explicit, Deckard's come with a smile. But that ethical hinge, that rooftop moment, lets them recognise they're fundamentally the same. And it lets us, the audience, experience that same realisation through empathy. Which raises another philosophical question. If we've defined slavery, and Blade Runner's definition sounds pretty accurate to me, then what is freedom? Because if slavery in this city means captured body, time and choices, then freedom can't be a poster in a subway tunnel. It has to be something you can actually do under all of this acid rain. You know, habits and refusals that still work when the file has already decided who you are. 4 conditions for me emerge from the film, and each gets kind of its own image. The first is recognition in Hegel's sense. Not status or badges, but a willingness to risk yourself so another appears as a subject, not as a task. The rooftop makes this concrete. Roy spends what little time remains to save someone the city has deemed expendable. That's recognition with teeth. That's recognition that costs life. If you want a real empathy test, it's this. Will you risk something of your own for a face that you're not paid to see? And honestly, as powerful as that question is in Blade Runner's fictional world, it hits even harder in our actual moment, right now. Second, there's time, and Marx's blunt truth. Control the clock, control the person. Freedom begins where you answer that control with an exit, however small, with declining the job, with delaying the shot, with walking away, with making your own choices. Because without reliable hours, you can't make promises. And without promises, you can't be free in any meaningful sense. And third, it demands what we might call opacity, the right for you to be more than paperwork. Blade Runner's system rules through a bureaucratic legibility. There's categories and implants and dossiers that speak for you, origami that claims to know your dreams. But any space they can't measure becomes space where you might move, where you might escape. The film predates our own surveillance economy, but the lesson transfers perfectly. We need undocumented spaces where we can actually be ourselves and be free. And fourth, essential for freedom is binding. Levinas's insight that responsibility to another isn't an afterthought, but is the first limit on what you're allowed to do. Deckard has no exit that doesn't go through seeing Rachel as a face rather than as a case. And this isn't some genre shortcut to redemption. It's the ongoing practice that prevents escape from collapsing into some form of selfish flight. Deckard's defiance creates an example, a possibility for others to follow. Without binding himself to Rachel, he might drift back to the job that blinded him. Earlier scripts actually had that exact ending, but Scott rejected it because it was too bleak, because there's no hope of freedom in that ending and that denial. Add these together and freedom stops being a warm feeling and becomes a discipline. It requires risk recognition. It requires you to reclaim time. It requires you to protect your opacity. It requires you to bind yourself to others. Sure, none of us can topple a pyramid alone, but that's partially the point. Pyramids run on systems that replace their gods without missing a beat. What these 4 practices do is they crack the system where it touches your life. They make it harder for the machine to turn your hours, your attention, and your language against the people standing right in front of you. But we still need to ask one essential question. Who profits from capturing our time? Who built this world where minutes are rationed, where empathy gets scored, and opportunity floats past on a blimp? Well, for that, we need to go upstairs to meet the men who would be gods. The opening shot of Blade Runner has to be one of the most commented upon in the film, not just because of the practical effects and how spectacular they are and how good that shot over Los Angeles in 2019 looks, but because it sets up the themes that we've just been discussing. And most notable is that ever-present mausoleum, the giant Pharaoh's Pyramid, come Mayan ziggurat that we later discover houses the Tyrell Corporation, with Eldon Tyrell living right at the very top. Ridley Scott can even be a little heavy-handed in this message as he overlays the shot of an eye, a kind of big brother in that opening scene too. And the message is not subtle. We know who rules over this overcrowded hellscape. It's oligarchs like Tyrell, who live on a completely different scale than the rest of the characters in the film, and whose knowing smirk seems to indicate that they're quietly in charge. Except that they're not. And if we revisit that wonderful scene where Roy meets his maker and extracts his Nietzschean revenge, I think most in the audience would be shocked by just how helpless Tyrell is in the face of his creation. And that despite all of the vast resources at his command, not only is he unable to help Roy, but he is unable to help himself. The message from Scott so far is pretty clear. Even the most advantaged in this world are as human as the rest of us. Even they die. But Scott's critique was originally meant to be even more powerful, because as Paul Salmon points out in his book, the script they wanted to shoot had a very disturbing discovery in it. On killing Tyrell, Roy discovers he's a replicant. Not the real Tyrell at all, just a useful clone. And in the original script, Roy intimidates Sebastian into taking him up one more level and discovers the awful truth. A dead, or a dying in some versions, Tyrell, frozen in a giant sarcophagus. The helpless god of this world has been dead for a long time. And in that script, Roy just leaves, and shocked that his quest has come to such an abrupt end. Now, they couldn't shoot it because they ran out of money, so they had to simplify. And I think it's a damn shame, because next to Zora's snake dance, it would have been one of the great missing scenes of Blade Runner. And I think it adds a subtlety to those pyramids and the men who would be gods that we glimpse at the start of the film, because they are trapped too. They're also caught in a decaying system that has allowed them to profit, sure, but still holds them tight to the hellish landscape we've glimpsed. They can build up and try and separate themselves as much as they like, but they are still alienated like the rest of us. As Hegel points out, the master takes no risk and purchases security at the cost ultimately of others and of their own selves. They are also hidden from themselves, and worse. And the overall point is a little bit Foucault too, and it's this: it's not a matter of killing the king. For one thing, they often just get replaced by another king, but deeper than that, and reflecting on a modern rather than a feudal society, there is no king to kill. The system runs without a sovereign. It's an extension of the horrifying logic that Agamben references and that we discussed at the start of this video, which was, I admit, a long time ago. So let's wrap it up. Because I think that one of the reasons that Blade Runner, the film, flopped at the box office in 1982 is because it's dense. I think my winding philosophical spouting has shown that, and also because there's so much in it. But it also flopped because it's a dark and unwelcome warning about a form of capitalism run amok and the cost it extracts on the most vulnerable amongst us. And it's not surprising that these seem to be the themes that keep cropping up in the film, because they turn up throughout Ridley Scott's work. They're there even in Alien. And he's a man that grew up knowing poverty and who struggled to forge an artistic career for himself. And here's a bit of score settling that I feel really passionate about, because while making this very film, the critique itself, he was fighting for control with two arseholes called Bud Yorkin and Jerry Perencino, financiers who were looking to enrich themselves in any way, shape or form they could, and even tried to unsuccessfully fire the creative team off the film and take control and remake it themselves, which what the hell would that have even looked like? But like Tyrell, one could argue that they are the true villains of the piece. I certainly would. Yet from another perspective, they too, those greedy little bastards, are trapped, simply performing their role as machines that accumulate money and divorce themselves from everything else, including their many wives. And there are, after all, plenty of money men out there and now. You eat the rich and there's just a bunch of more money grubbers waiting in the wings. The little people who would be gods. We live with them today, just as much as we know they're going to end up just like Eldon Tyrell. And they're varying degrees of alienated themselves. This is the most frustrating thing about them, is that despite all of their exploitation and all of the things, the misery and all of that, they seem just as unhappy as everybody else. Yet through their power and their wealth, they're taking a whole lot more people with them. And Blade Runner, after all, is simply a 2-hour film made under difficult circumstances. It's never going to solve all of these problems, but hopefully I've convinced you that it has raised them in the most stylish way possible. And in this box office of 1982 with E.T. warming hearts and everybody flush with Reagan republicanism, maybe this doomer message was never going to resonate. But it definitely resonates now. And it has given us a glimpse of a possibility of how bad things can get if we do nothing. Okay, fine. For our last point, let's discuss whether Deckard was a replicant or not. Here's the answer. Almost everyone who worked on the film thought that he wasn't. In fact, they thought that Deckard being a replicant would undermine the whole point of the film, which is two different beings realising they are the same and finding an understanding and peace. Ridley Scott, for his part, originally wanted to leave it ambiguous and flew a bit by the seat of his pants in deciding. He always intended Deckard's short unicorn dream and the origami to suggest that maybe Deckard was, and he included an accidental shot of Harrison Ford's eyes flashing because it was a nice dramatic twist for the audience alone. In later years, he seems to have settled on the idea that Deckard definitely was a replicant, but Paul Salmon contends that this was a later development in Ridley's thinking. Blade Runner 2049, which will be making an appearance in Philosophical Film Club soon, leaves the question suitably ambiguous. More, I suspect, as a bit of fan service, and because there would be riots in the streets if definitively the question was answered one way or another. But to get the Deckard as a replicant narrative to work, you have to read a lot of convoluted Nexus 7 related conspiracy theories into the film on no evidence. And even if it were true, why this guy? Why this one unlucky Blade Runner who wasn't even the first Blade Runner on the case? But the bigger point within the movie, as I hope I've shown, is that to spend our time on the question is to miss the much harder and more important questions that the film presses us to answer. Demands, really, that the audience comes to terms with in our encounter with the film, just like in Levinas's encounter with the other. Because the movie is asking an ethical question about choices. The replicants don't prove their case by passing some sort of essence test. They prove it in acts that any ordinary moral vocabulary recognises, through fear, through care, through solidarity, and through mercy. Zora runs for her life. Pris protects the only person who showed her any kindness. Rachel saves the man who just measured her. Roy risks the last minutes he has to spare and forgive an enemy. If you need a twist to make those intelligible, it's meaningful because he's secretly one of them, then you missed the indictment that the film has pretty firmly been pressing the whole time. The problem is not what Deckard is, it's what he does when the system orders him to. And Roy's final speech is the radical break that allows Deckard to reclaim what he is. And Levinas would call it a saying of the said. Most of us would simply say that it's beautiful. So no, the question was never who is a replicant. The hunted replicants prove they are human in the only sense that matters, by how they treat the lives around them. And yes, at first, they don't get it completely right. But that's the only way we can prove it too, even in a bad system. And as the credits roll, we're left in the here and now, but with a little message. Because if to live in fear is to live as a slave, then the only honest response is to fight the decay that feeds on that fear. One modest gesture at a time. Deckard's escape is small, and that's the point. Because enough of those tears brings forth a righteous rain that can sweep away anything that stands before it. So, until next time, be wise and be kind and watch out for the rain.